The following podcast is brought to you by patreon.com/WrestleMedia.ca. Like what you hear? Want more of it ad-free, uncensored, and earlier? Sign up today at patreon.com/WrestleMedia.ca and start getting more for as little as $2 a month.
Welcome to We Have Till 5, part of WrestleMedia, where everything is wrestling, and this feels weird. Can you
You want me to do it?
Yeah, this feels really weird, man. Go ahead.
Welcome to We Have Till 5.
Never mind, this is the new generation.
Okay,
I should probably do it.
Sorry. Am I the Randy Savage to your Shawn Michaels on this? Let me see. You gotta bring in Macho Man to save the day. Maybe Jeff the Hand will pay me big bucks to jump ship over to Forging the Future.
Maybe he will. Probably will. You can join the bad faction, and then the good. You could turn heel and face 15 times over the course.
Then I'll have an incredible feud with Danny Parkhill over some last man standing matches that will be incredibly recognized, and then a year afterwards he'll get the world title.
Absolutely. Well. Anyways, all jokes aside, welcome to We Have Till 5. I am Andrew. With me, as you have heard, is the immaculate, the understated, the unbelievable, the absolute piece of human garbage.
What? Oh, you swerved me. This is like watching.
It's like what?
This is like watching A Simple Favor.
Adam, thanks for coming on today, man.
No problem, man. I'm glad to be here. And may I just say to everybody listening to this for free at WrestleMedia.ca on SoundCloud or iTunes or Spotify or however you like listening to fine podcasts, if you're sitting there going, what is he talking about? A Simple Favor? I don't know anything about that movie, or what does that have to do with anything they're talking about? Well, let me tell you, you would know all about that if you are one of our patrons over at patreon.com/WrestleMedia.ca, because those people who had paid a few ducats in the bucket every month have gotten the extra content for this show. We have some time in which Andrew and I started talking about books other than wrestling books that we like, and ended it with one of the worst endings to a movie I've ever seen. So go ahead and put a few ducats in the bucket at patreon.com/WrestleMedia.ca to get all those details. Andrew?
That was pretty good, man.
Thanks, man.
That's how it's done.
You're right. It is how we do things.
That's how it's done.
Done, son. And one of the other things we quickly mentioned on the Patreon is that we're going to be doing some more book reviews.
Yeah, we are.
Which kind of ties into today's topic, doesn't it?
Sure does, yeah. If you ever need any help with that, I read at a third grade level. and I can usually finish one of the Big Word books.
Oh, good.
In 6 to 8 months.
Excellent. I think for our first review, we're going to look at The Puppy Who Lost His Way. It's a Billy Madison reference for anybody, which kind of counts because there is a masked wrestler in that movie.
Like a real wrestler?
No.
So now,
well, kind of technically.
Does that count?
Because somebody that is very close to you and I, someone who may or may not have been a host on our programs here, did go by the moniker of the Masked Hideous Blob for a little while. So.
But you're not allowed to say who.
But I'm not allowed to say who, lest the name of the blob of Blobby be sullied.
Yeah,
so
you wouldn't want that.
We certainly would not have wanted that to happen. But if you want to maybe guess who that is, they could probably go onto our social media and guess.
Yeah,
because
bring it on.
We're on a bunch of different social media platforms. Like what, Andrew?
Like we're on Twitter.
Yes, we are.
We're on Facebook.
We are.
We're on Instagram.
We are.
We're on Tout. We're on TikTok.
We are not on Tout.
What?
We're not on TikTok.
What do you mean?
No, we're not that cool.
What do you mean, man?
No.
You don't have a Tout?
We are still on Vine, though, and I don't know how that happened, because Vine's dead, so...
Man, we would have friggin' ruled Vine.
You think so?
Oh, yeah.
We would have been Vinesters?
We would have been absolutely top of the tree on Vine.
Top of the tree on Vine. I see what you did there. Well done. And if you want to see what we're doing on social media, what's kind of the thing that they need to just search for? You don't know. It's okay. It's all right. Any of those platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WrestleMedia.ca. At WrestleMedia.ca. That's it. All right. So we've shilled, we've shilled the patrons.
Yep.
We've shilled for social media.
Uh-huh.
Okay, we can save the rest for a little bit later on then. That's fine. Oh, you know what? Actually, there is one other thing I can show and tie back into it, because we were talking about books and doing reviews in blog format, because we haven't had as many blogs lately, and I think it would make sense to do reviews of the written word in the written word. Makes sense, right?
It's poetic, man.
And yeah, exactly. And, we might end up doing some previews of that, some pre-previews with our newsletter, which you can get for free over at WrestleMedia.ca. Every single week you'll get the highlights, the best stuff of the week, and some free previews, maybe even some exclusive content. and contests. Content and contests.
Wow.
And my mouth got all marbled for a minute there.
That was weird, man. I thought you were Randy Savage.
Oh, yeah. Never get mixed up in the mouth. Yeah.
I bet you that's something he said.
Never get mixed up in the mouth. Yeah, probably.
I could definitely hear Randy Savage. Oh, yeah, you better, kid. You're getting a little mixed up in the mouth.
Yeah. You know what would help with that if you snapped into a Slim Jim?
Oh, yeah. Adam, are you a connoisseur of wrestling books?
You know what? I have perused a few titles in my day. I don't know if I would consider myself a connoisseur, but I consider myself a fan. I like wrestling books quite a bit, actually.
I've always been a fan, even just of the medium of. Just to sort of backtrack for 1 second, it's why I listen to the wrestling podcast. It's why I like being part of the wrestling podcast. It's why, in addition to WrestleMedia content, I do listen to stuff like the Pritchard Show and,
Traitor!
Get out of town. Because the wrestling business is fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
It is a fascinating industry. And previous to all of this podcast stuff, the way to sort of digest that was wrestling books. You had to kind of pick up and read the written word to be able to, kind of get the behind the scenes. It was like the first place that wrestlers were allowed to kind of talk about the industry outside of kayfabe.
I'd say even before that, you look at your dirt sheets.
Yeah,
because that was also
wrestlers like interviewing. I came a long way after
names would be protected, but I guess it depends on how much you believe in the validity of those things, right?
Fair enough.
Because if you believed in the validity of the Observer, they would have quotes and they would have insight from those within the business, right? So you could even use that as an example. But even still, it was the written word back then.
Yeah.
You could point to stuff like Pro Wrestling Illustrated or The Wrestler, but that's course true. We all know right. That's all gimmicked. It was all kayfabe stuff. Yeah. But, it was our little peek into the world, which is why we loved it so much, I think that's just any kind of world that we are enamored with but don't understand. People want to know about it, right? Human beings are hungry for narratives and we're hungry for information. And if you can get both of them, like in the world of pro wrestling, it's a pretty tempting mix, shall we say.
Sure is. That's what we're dealing with this week. I just started rereading one of the books on this list, so I'm not going to give away which one. I just started rereading.
I have a guess,
and it did sort of spark the list, and it got me thinking. Now, I just want a disclaimer right up front. I'm doing this almost as much for your feedback, for those of you who are listening today, because I do not claim to have read every wrestling book out there, and there are some tremendous wrestling books that are not on this list because I have not read them yet. And while I have heard tremendous things about them, and I've heard that they're unbelievable reads, and that they're factual, and that they're believable, and they're but they're not on this list. This list is just the 5 best that I have personally read to date. So don't send me any hate tweets or anything like if your favorite book. Instead, send it as a suggestion.
Promote what you love. Yes. Don't tear down what you hate.
Yeah, this is by no means meant to be a comprehensive list of the absolute 5 greatest wrestling books ever. These are the 5 best wrestling books on my shelf.
Be an Andrew Kent. Don't be an Adam Conta. He builds them up. I tear them down.
That's very true.
Why don't we get to tearing some down right now, Andrew? Can I start off by asking you, is the first wrestling book you ever read on this list?
No, but I really, really, really wanted it to be there. But
I'm wondering if it's the same as mine.
But it's not great.
It's probably the same book as a lot of people's first wrestling books.
Because I think mine was like the first one I could remember.
Okay, well, so what was the first wrestling book you ever read?
The Rock. The Rock Says.
So it is not the same book as the first one that I read. What did you... I agree with you. It is not great.
It's not good. But
In fact, I will go on a limb and say it's one of the worst wrestling books I've ever read.
It was on about every list as one of the worst ones.
It's pretty bad.
But I was a kid when it came out,
sure.
So it was one of the first big books I ever read. Sure. I was pretty fired up about it. And it was The Rock, and it was wrestling. And so, no, I couldn't put it on this list. I tried. It's an honorable mention just because it was the first one I ever read.
And the term autobiography is very loose in quotations for this book.
I would love to go back and read it again. I'm gonna buy it. I gotta read it.
Someone's
it was
gotta,
only like 230 pages, but like big print. Like
Sure.
I could read it in a day.
Now I'm gonna hold off on saying the first book I read because I'm assuming it's on this list because it's a pretty damn good book tome. So
yeah.
Let's start off with number 5.
Number 5 is a book that originally when I picked it up, actually no, I think my mom got it for me for Christmas one year, and not that I'm not interested in this person. But just the book looked like it was going to be cheap, and the font in it was like, it just looked like this book's not going to be any good. That sounds strange, but it's Eddie Guerrero's book.
Okay.
What was it called? It was Cheating Death and
Stealing
Life. And it turned out to be obviously one of my 5 favorites. It was incredibly honest. He was far too honest about his struggles for me to like believe that he was lying about much else. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, man, how could you be so honest about the things that you were actually struggling with? So when you're able to be that open and vulnerable and honest, it makes you, the things that you're saying, believable, right? Like Hulk Hogan's book is obviously not on this list.
Which one?
The one that has been basically 95% disproven.
The one he released with WWE?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. Because he did release 2 books.
Did he?
Yes,
Was
he
the other
did.
one better than the first one or second? I don't know.
It was okay. I thought the first one had better stories,
Well,
but that's probably because it was ghost written.
and demonstrably unfactual.
I will say this. I think the first one was more Hulk Hogan.
Classic Hogan.
In that book, Andre the Giant weighed 800 pounds, and there was over 2 million people in the Silverdome, brother.
Did he actually say those words?
No, he did not.
Oh, okay.
But
okay,
he has been called out for exaggerating
Sure.
stuff like that. But again, that's why I say it's the most Hulk Hogan book, because Hulk Hogan exaggerates things.
Yeah.
And I will say, in his defense, as a lifelong Hulkamaniac, that's his job. His job is to make things larger than life and
Sure.
bigger than life, brother. That's what he does. That's what he does.
Yeah.
So I can't hate him for it.
I definitely appreciated Eddie's honesty and his openness and, kind of chronicling how he made it to WWE and what it was like growing up as a Guerrero, his time with Art Bar in Mexico, as well as, his foray into WCW and kind of how that started, his switch over to WWF with Chris Benoit, Perry Saturn, and Dean Malenko, and then his release from the company, because he got released at a time where I wouldn't say I was like really smart in the business, so I didn't even know he was gone.
Yep.
I didn't know that he was. I guess I assumed he was hurt, or because he was gone 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, he was gone from 1990. Nope, sorry. He got released in 2000.
2001.
No, it might have been 2001. Yes, because he worked WrestleMania 17. But he wasn't there for 18. He was there shortly thereafter, though. So he was gone for maybe a little over a year,
Okay,
maybe not even a full year.
A little shorter.
It was not a long time.
But
he cleaned up quick.
I had no idea that he. I knew before I read this book, but I was perusing the internet one night and I saw like an old match with Eddie Guerrero. Was it Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, and CM Punk or something like that?
Yes.
Like, I was like, what is going on with this? I have no idea where this came from. So he has a fascinating career and a fascinating outlook on life. And that was, in his honesty, just with the struggles of alcoholism were just amazing. He said, one of the things, and it's always stuck with me, is the idea of, and not that I didn't think alcoholism wasn't a disease or anything like that. I'm not here to but his appropriation of it was great. He said, listen, some people can go out and have 2. I cannot. I gotta have 0 or I gotta have 50. He's like, that's just what I realized about myself, and I gotta have 0 then.
Is that your favorite part in the book? What is your favorite part in the book?
I think that was I think just how him and his family kind of reconcile all of that was my favorite bits of that wrestling. That and his relationship with Art Bar and just the heartbreaking storytelling behind Art Bar's death.
I also read this book.
Yeah.
My favorite part in the book is him talking about going back to the Indies and being asked to put over guys like Low Key and CM Punk and Rey Mysterio, and about how he didn't really have any objections to it, and it really caught promoters off guard. And because of his willingness to put over the guys in the local promotions, he started getting a lot more bookings because people would be like, man, Eddie Guerrero, a legend, is willing to come in and put our guys over. Let's book him for that kind of stuff. So I just thought it was really fascinating because I've never heard wrestlers talk about that very much. Do you mind if I tell a personal story related to this book?
Of course.
I started reading Eddie Guerrero's book or either just after or right before I went through a very difficult breakup.
Oh, wow.
I was in love with this girl. I honestly thought I was going to marry her one day, and it didn't work out. And I read Eddie Guerrero's book, and it kind of helped me get through a lot of the feelings that I was dealing with. And I know that as somebody who takes his faith very seriously, you'll find this interesting. I felt like reading Eddie's book encouraged me to try and reconnect with my faith, because obviously that was very important to Eddie Guerrero.
Absolutely.
And that does come through in the book. And it did encourage me to go back and maybe try and reconnect a little bit to my faith. So it's a powerful book.
It's a very powerful book. It's, I would say it's probably the most powerful book on this list. I would say, just because I think Eddie more than any of these other guys, and obviously I believe these are quote unquote better books, but I don't think anybody on this list was quite as just unflinchingly raw and real than Eddie.
That's fair. I don't know that I agree with you. I think that there's a book that will be on your list coming up where I think that person was a bit more raw and honest, but we'll talk about that later what I assume is when we get to it. All right, let's go to number 4.
Number 4 is one that I actually I didn't read. It was one that I got through Audible. It's one that I listened to.
Fascinating.
Read by the actual wrestler himself. It's Daniel Bryan's book.
Can I be honest with you?
Yeah.
That's how I listened to Hulk Hogan's first book in the WWE.
For real?
Was Audible.
He read it?
Yeah, you could buy on CD.
Was it him who read it?
It was Hulk Hogan reading it. I will not lie when I say that it definitely added having Hulk Hogan tell these stories.
Absolutely.
Personally. So here's my recommendation. The Hulk Hogan book itself, not very factual, clearly. But if you can, find the audiobook of it with Hulk Hogan reading it, and it's a fun listening to Hulk Hogan tell these stories. So I'm assuming you had a similar experience with the Daniel Bryan
it
book.
was, because it felt like Daniel Bryan was just sitting there telling me a story. And I've been a fan of Daniel Bryan, Bryan Danielson, for many years. He was one of the really gigantic standouts for me when I kind of got, once I got a little older and I realized that, what do you mean it's not just WWF?
Yeah.
Because WCW was still alive for a couple years when I started watching, but they were gone pretty fast.
Right.
So I'm like, oh, I guess there's only WWF now. And then I'm like, what do you mean there's what is this ROH?
There's not even a W in the name.
Yeah, what am I even... Row?
Does the R stand for wrestling?
Wrestling of Honor?
Wrestling of Honor.
So he was one of the guys that caught my eye. Obviously, I was always a fan of the Eddie Guerreros and the Dean Malenkos and Chris Benoit's, and I from an early age, my brother was always the Jeff Hardy, the Rey Mysterio. Not that Rey Mysterio can't wrestle, but he was like, whoa, that guy can do 38 flips.
He was into the spectacle.
He was into the spectacle.
He was into the Daredevils.
And I was like, can I just watch Angle and Benoit on repeat, please? And my brother's like sleeping through that match. I'm like, what is wrong with you? This is the real stuff.
Meanwhile, I'm over here like, more Doink the Clown.
Where's Doink, bud?
I'm trying to think of who would be that equivalent in that 2001, 2002 time frame where it was mostly a big character.
Hurricane?
See, I don't know. I mean, yeah, maybe. You know what? Just for simplicity's sake, so we won't drag the episode on. Sure, I'll be over here going like, more Hurricane. That makes sense.
So I was very interested in hearing his story, Daniel Bryan, because I knew very little. Even at that time when I listened to that book, I knew a lot more about indie wrestlers and like the promotions and stuff like that. But I wouldn't necessarily say I knew what it took in the 2000s to go and become a wrestler, because it's a very different process now for a lot of wrestlers, because there's more places for you to go. There's more exposure. You can get on the internet. People will see you a lot easier than just because I've only revealed one book so far on this list, than an Eddie Guerrero, right? Eddie Guerrero, and Eddie Guerrero has a different story than most people because he was born into basically Mexican wrestling royalty. So he didn't have necessarily the same path as just,
a Daniel Bryan.
So I was fascinated to sort of hear how it got started. His experience in the Shawn Michaels wrestling school, and kind of one of the more fascinating stories he kind of told was how ROH's business was driven. Have you read this book at all?
I haven't read it yet.
It's very good. It's very good. How ROH's business, I guess, was driven almost primarily by DVD sales.
Yeah.
By DVD sales.
That does not surprise me, because that is how I was first exposed to Ring of Honor, was copies of Pro Wrestling Illustrated.
Yeah.
Their first strategy was they bought full-page ads in Pro Wrestling Illustrated, which was an order form. And it was like, here's all the shows, and then they would list some of the big matches, and then you would click them off, you'd mail out the coupon with the money in it, and then you got your DVD. So, yes, because originally Ring of Honor was Rob Feinstein, and who ran RF Video. He had a DVD business, so it makes sense that it would be a tape trader, DVD kind of based business.
So one of the sort of caveats to that, and one sort of word of mouth was ridiculously important with ROH, because they wanted to sell these DVDs, because they were only getting 500 people to the shows, and they could only make so much money doing live shows. So Daniel Bryan had this idea that he wanted to do something that was basically never done, and he wanted to have an hour-and-a-half wrestling match with Austin Aries. Yeah. I think they ended up only going 75 minutes. But the thought with this was, we don't care if the crowd leaves. In fact, we encourage them before the match, listen, this is what we're doing. If you are bored, please leave. Because we can't have the fans crap on the match, because then nobody will want to. But word of mouth, what do you mean Bryan Danielson and Austin Aries had an hour and a half? They went 90 minutes?
Right.
What do you mean they went 90 minutes? Was it a 2 out of 3? It was a one fall match that they did for 90 minutes? And just that idea itself was to sell DVDs. They only ended up going about 75 minutes because fans weren't leaving and they were starting to get bored and started crapping on the match, so they had to go home. But that was a fascinating story that I would never have necessarily thought they would have wanted to go that far. We are recording matches specifically for DVD audiences in mind.
Yep.
And we don't care if we start with 500 people in the building and we end with 200. It doesn't matter, as long as they're not booing like they're falling asleep in their chairs. So it was just the way that they were driving business, and sort of getting that insight from Daniel Bryan was unbelievable, and that's definitely a story that stuck with me through the last couple of years since I read it, for sure.
Awesome. Let's move on to number 3.
Number 3 is there's debate on because this individual has written several books at this point, I think 4, people say maybe his second one was the best, and I disagree. His first one's the best. This is Chris Jericho's Lion Tail Around the World in Spandex.
Again, not the author that I thought you were talking about, but I'm glad you want to talk about this. I agree. I think his second book is better than this first one. I do.
Really?
Not to take anything away from the first one, which is fantastic. I've enjoyed every book that Chris Jericho has written. All of his autobiographies are great.
I'm interested in his fourth. I didn't love his third.
Okay.
I didn't love his third book. What one was that? Best in the World at What I Have No Idea?
Yes.
It wasn't bad, but it was just, it felt kind of like, hey, number 1 and number 2 worked. It felt kind of like a Nickelback album.
Could you explain?
Hey, that worked. Let's do that 8 more times.
But it still works.
Sure. You're right. But
I happen to like Satellites. Thank you very much.
But I like new. You know why I think Alexis on Fire is one of the best bands in history.
I don't.
They reinvent themselves every single album, whether you like their music or not. And I'm sure you don't strike me as a hardcore kind of screamo guy. So.
I like their cover of Heart of Darkness, not Heart of Darkness. Sorry. They did a cover of a Midnight Oil song.
Really?
Back in the day. True Country or the
Alexis on Fire?
I am so sorry. Yes, I'm rambling and I apologize. The point I'm making is I'm not a huge Alexis on Fire fan, but I like that one song they did.
Sure. But what I like about them is that they reinvent themselves. It doesn't take a gigantic fan to be able to pick their albums apart because they all sound pretty different. So while I enjoyed Jericho's third book, I would never say that I don't like it. There's absolutely no realm of possibility of me saying, oh, it sucked. It just felt like, okay, so this is how you write books. Cool. And how many books would Stephen King have written if he written the same book 500 times?
Dead Heart.
Yeah. The Dead Heart.
The Dead Heart by Alexis on Fire.
I genuinely don't know that song.
I don't think it's on their discography. I think it was kind of like a cover thing that they did, but it's a cover of a 1980s kind of alternative Australian band. They did the song Beds Are Burning. How can we sleep while our beds? So they're actually, you know what? We're going down a way big rabbit hole here, and I'm
anyways,
sorry.
Jericho's first book, I think I noticed this in like superhero movies.
Okay.
That I always like the origin story the best. I like backstory. I love backstory. So it's great once I know the character, and then they can just go and they do character development from then on. It's not like I dislike movies beyond the and in fact I think superhero movies are getting so good now that I've got out of that mentality.
Sure.
But when they first started getting popular, like,
well, I mean, you must be excited for the Phase 4 slate because there's a lot of new faces showing up.
I'm very excited.
So you're going to get a lot of origin stories.
Very excited. So I think that is why I like Jericho's first book better, because it was Chris Jericho's origin story. It was I was a goofy kid in Winnipeg asking dumb questions to every wrestler that I met, and I like sort of the rise. Now, I like the second book because he kind of got into a little bit more about his struggles in WWE and stuff like that, and that was fascinating.
That was the stuff that I liked the most.
Yeah.
I loved, because we hear stories from guys who like come to the WWE and it's great, and it's just this great upward trajectory path, whereas Chris Jericho's like, like he crashes and burns.
Sure.
But here's the thing, as a fan watching it, I would have never guessed.
No, never.
Watching it as a fan, I'd be like, oh my God, are you kidding me? Jericho was on this meteoric rise from the start. And the behind the scenes truth was he struggled huge to adapt to the WWE, both the backstage politics as well as the style and everything. So it was very revealing for me as a fan. And again, like we mentioned earlier, that idea of like, I want to know more about this business. I'm curious. I'm fascinated by it.
Yeah.
So I think personally for me, that's why I prefer the second book.
And that's fair.
Plus, Jeff and I also went to a Chapters and got our copies of the book signed by the guy. So there's also an added personal touch to it. But I will say this. I have maybe gone back and read Spandex once. I've read How to Become the Heavyweight Champion in 1004 Easy Steps probably a good 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
I've gone back and I feel that one has more rereadability. I don't even know if that's a word, but you know what I mean. It has a lot of replay value.
Yeah, sure. No, and that's me with the first.
And that's
one.
how you feel about Spandex.
I've read that one probably 4 or 5 times.
What's your favorite story from it?
Oh my god!
Or part of the book? Doesn't have to necessarily be something specific.
Goldberg.
Oh, okay.
And that's why way back when at the beginning, like episode 2 or 3 of this show, we have till 5. That's why Goldberg landed on my best feuds, best Chris Jericho feuds, because that story has really stuck with me.
Sure. Through
the years of just him, being the workhorse and just really trying to get it over, and just the mess of WCW really not seeing where there's money to be made, and everybody took themselves a little bit too seriously in WCW, and that story has definitely stuck with me. A lot of the Mexico stuff, I love his time in Mexico. Just from him traveling down there, him getting basically robbed at gunpoint in Mexico, and becoming Corazon de Leon, and his interaction with Eddie Guerrero over Corazon de Leon. You know what? I genuinely can't remember if that's in the book or if that's just a story that goes
heard on Bruce Pritchard. I don't know.
Supplementary. I really can't remember at this point, but I love hearing about in his childhood. I thought his mom stuff was unbelievable.
Well, it had a big impact on him.
Clearly. Unbelievable stuff with his mom, and it felt a lot more of an, back to the Eddie Guerrero thing. It felt more honest and it felt more real than the stuff that he released sort of later in his career. The other ones always felt like a little bit more like, oh yeah, I'm also a rock star now, and I'm hanging out with all these rock stars, and I'm a huge big star. By the way, did you know I'm a big star?
But I like that. I'll tell you this.
I'm a gigantic star.
I'll tell you this. I didn't get that from any other wrestling biographies I've ever read. No one else is talking about being a huge rock star, because they ain't.
I know. It just felt a little bit,
much like the real Chris Jericho. He can back it up.
Felt like a Triple H entrance. You know what I'm talking about?
God. No, I don't actually. No, I don't.
Felt a little bit self-gratifying.
Because I'm sane and appreciate spectacle. So no, I don't know what you're talking about.
I like spectacle too. When it looks less like your.
No, you clearly don't know when it hits you right in the face with a giant Terminator skull. So there you go, sir.
Gosh.
Hey, this is a commercial for Patreon.com/WrestleMedia.ca, where you can get early access to episodes of your favorite WrestleMedia shows, get full uncut and uncensored versions of your favorite shows, and more. Don't want to hear this commercial on your podcast anymore? Sign up at our main event tier and get these episodes ad-free. Want to hear your own commercial here instead of ours? We've got tiers for that too. Visit Patreon.com/WrestleMedia.ca and join the WrestleMedia revolution today.
Can we get to the runner-up before we start fighting? We were doing so well.
My runner-up is going to surprise you.
Is it really? Wait a minute. Is it the Triple H bodybuilding book?
Yeah, that's the one, man.
Have you read that?
Do I look like I've read that?
I have read that book.
Oh my gosh! Of course you have, you friggin' mark.
It's not terrible. I mean,
that's what I like in my entertainment. That wasn't terrible.
I'll say this: it's less bodybuilding and more of his story than I expected.
Yeah,
there is some great stuff in there, but that's what when I read it, I thought, cool, I'm going to learn to work out and eat like Triple H, which I did try to do, and I couldn't. I just could not eat the sheer amount of food that guy puts into his body. The amount of food that he eats is insane. But I was surprised at how much of his story it actually is. So I would recommend that if you're kind of interested to know a little bit more about his past and Triple H's journey, do actually read that book, because there actually is a lot in there that I think fans would get more out of had they marketed it as more of it's Triple H's story, and there's also some bodybuilding stuff in there, as opposed to the opposite, which was like, learn how to be like Triple H. And he tells some stories too.
I don't know why this is making me think of this, but it's making me think of my absolute favorite. I think it's my favorite kayfabe news headline in history is wrestling fan who's been in a coma since 1991 or something like that is shocked to realize that Terra Rising runs the wrestling world. I don't know. It's just my favorite wrestling fan.
Fun fact that I learned from that book: he hated that name.
Well, how could you not?
Well, I mean, I liked it, but
yeah, but I mean, to be fair, that's not exactly the benchmark for.
No, that's true. You're absolutely right about that. All right, to your runner-up, sir.
Number 2 is Hitman. It's the Bret Hart book. It's got to be number 2 for me.
I knew it would be on this list.
It had to be.
I wasn't sure if it was going to make number 1 or not. This is the book where I feel like the guy was the most honest, which surprised the hell out of me when I read it.
I totally agree with you. It's much like Eddie Guerrero's book, a man who was that honest about his infidelities and his, just who he was.
That was my favorite stuff in the book, believe it or not. And not because I like seeing a guy downfall. I like that he was honest.
Yeah.
Because as we've talked before, Bret Hart takes his legacy very seriously.
And that's my criticism of this book.
He does take his criticism, but he's honest, where he says, look, I did these things, but this is my story, and I want to tell it warts and all. And I respect and admire the fact that he was able to do that.
Yeah.
So that, I think, was my favorite part of the book, was learning, there's a vulnerable human side to Bret Hart that we haven't always seen, because in the public eye, he feels he has to protect his image so much. So I enjoyed that aspect of it. Plus, it's also an incredible chronicle of the wrestling business from his time in Stampede all the way up until the most recent, whenever the book was released. It is a fascinating journey.
It's I would say, knowing full well that I have not read every wrestling book out there, I would be shocked to find a more comprehensive chronicling of one's career.
Yep. But this is because Bret wrote, like, he had a journal that he kept with him his entire career, and he wrote down these stories and feelings and matches and all these, so that because he knew one day, I'm going to turn this into a book. He was smart. He was thinking ahead.
And one thing I like about this one, and not that he's the only one that has done this, but as far as I know, there's no ghostwriter involved with this Bret Hart book, correct?
Bret's was 100% legit autobiography. And
I love this book. I love this book. And the reason why, I'm waffling on my earlier statement about the most open and honest, but I think what rubs me wrong about this book a little bit is, I know that he was honest about sort of like his personal life, but he's got such a chip on his shoulder when it comes to his work. It almost reads as a guy who is so afraid that people won't remember him that he has to be his biggest fan.
You ever read Dynamite Kid's book?
No, but I've heard a lot of mixed stuff.
I would be fascinated for you to read that, because you want to talk about a guy who kind of blurs the lines of reality and kayfabe to make himself look good, pales in comparison. It's a lot of like, if Dynamite would lose a big match, it was all a bunch of work and politics. But if he ever won matches, it was real, and he was the best fighter in the world.
That being said, here's like sort of my like flip side, my antithesis to Bret Hart takes himself too seriously. That statement is that I think in pro wrestling, there's a few careers out there where I really think that you need to believe that you are the best, and it's why I don't have an issue with any wrestler going out and saying, I really am the best in the world at what I do. Like, I really am. Seth Rollins coming out and saying that, like, I truly believe that I'm the best pro wrestler on the planet. You can agree with him, you can disagree, it doesn't matter. But I think to do this job properly, I think you need to believe that you're the best in the whole world. I think wrestlers, I think to be a great chef, you have to feel that way. I think there's a couple, honestly, even as an actor, any sort of entertainment, you have to believe that you're the best out there. Or at least that you have the capability that if you're given the right opportunity, you can prove that you're the best.
I think in most competitive industries, you have to have a mentality of that either you are the best or you want to continue to be the best. You want to strive to be the best. I get what you're saying, but I think that there is a way to have that mentality and balance it at the same time. Sure. I think what sometimes is that Bret Hart takes it to a level that sometimes comes off as a bit delusional. And I think that's the problem, is that, a guy like Chris Jericho goes around and says, I'm the best at what I do. But he'll also turn around and say, now, I'm a great wrestler. I'm not as great as, ankle locks as Kurt Angle or something like that. He still at least tries to keep it real. Yeah. Whereas I think people, when they hear some of the things, I will give you my favorite example of Bret Hart taking himself too seriously. When they released one of the WWE 2K video games not long ago, Bret went on social media and complained that his stats were lower than Triple H's, because he felt that he was better than Triple H. When you get to the level of, like, I'm the best in the world, and I believe it so much so that the stats on a video game are encouraging me to speak out about it, that's that level where I'm like, okay, calm down, buddy.
Yeah.
That's kind of indefensible.
That's the kind of thing where you can be privately upset, like, I'm 10 times the wrestler that Triple H ever was. Yeah. But maybe I'm not 10 times the star that Triple H is, and that maybe the stats, you can be like privately a little miffed,
even if you believe that, even if you think it's absolutely true, right? Which, in terms of wrestling, absolutely Bret Hart's way better than Triple H. But like you said, it's a video game is the point I'm making here.
Oh, gosh.
That's the point I'm making.
You've read this book, obviously.
Yes, I have. A couple of times.
Oh, yeah, I've read it like 4
times. And the only reason I haven't read it more is because it's a big one.
Yeah.
It's enjoyable.
Yeah.
But it's a long read.
It's a huge read. Yeah. I honestly, I don't even know how to pick a favorite story in this, because I think Right from the start, I think it's all fascinating. I think it is all fascinating. I think what it's like growing up in that hard house with 11 brothers and sisters.
All together, yeah.
Like, fascinating. Mm-hmm. You know, some of the insights on Stu Hart and, you know, kind of his disciplinary style, but also mixed with his like really just like believing in his kids and loving his kids and how much he loved and appreciated wrestling.
I think you got an intimate look at Stu that a lot of fans hadn't really seen before. I think there have been books written about Stu, and my favorite book of all time gives a little bit of insight into him as well. But we can talk about that later.
Sure.
But you're right. I think that the depictions of everything and his viewpoint, and again, I think that comes from the fact that this is not Bret Hart writing from memory. This is Bret Hart saying, "This is the way I was thinking about it at the time. This is what happened. This is my recollections of April 6, 1986, from April 6, 1986."
Yeah,
and I think that plays a big part in it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I can't imagine who's listening to WrestleMedia podcasts who have not read this book unless you just really hate reading.
You might not be a big reader, but hopefully we can change your mind on a couple of these because I think they're worth it.
It's just an absolutely staggering look into pro wrestling.
Here's one thing I will say, just to kind of interrupt that.
Yeah, of course.
Is, if you can find these books on audio or Audible, we know that you like listening to people talk about wrestling. If you're listening to this podcast, maybe that's the way to do it. And if that's the case, if that's what gets you to listen to some of these great stories, try and seek it out if you can, because it's worth it. These are great stories. At the end of the day, they're good narratives. All right, do we have time for, we're already kind of gone over time a little bit, so let's just jump into some honorable mentions, some ones that didn't make the list. I think some of the books that I am going to mention aren't your number one, so I don't mind talking about them. So let's go ahead with some of your honorable mentions.
I only really wrote down one, two, because I was just going to talk about The Rock Says, one of the worst books in history, but it sparked my love for the behind the scenes to wrestling. So I definitely deserve some credit there.
Okay. That was the only one you wanted to mention? You don't want to talk about China's book?
No, I haven't read China's book.
It's okay,
I heard it's real bad too.
Yeah.
But the other one I wrote down was one of Mick Foley's lesser known memoirs, is his Hardcore Diaries book.
Okay.
I've read that like 10 times. It's short, it's sweet, and it's comprehensive on one event specifically. And everything leading up to ECW One Night Stand 2006, the big tag team match that they had. Fascinating read.
It's a good one. I think I liked Foley is Good a little bit better than that one, but that's okay. I still think it's an okay book. I'm going to put It's Good to Be the King on there. Jerry Lawler's book is fascinating to me. Jerry Lawler is one of my favorite wrestlers of all time, so there's a little bit of a personal bias there. But I also felt like reading this book, I felt connected to Jerry Lawler. Like, I could relate to Jerry Lawler a little bit more. He seemed like the kind of wrestler that I would have maybe ended up being someday. Plus, as Bruce Pritchard has said on his podcast, Jerry Lawler has lived an incredibly charmed life. And it's interesting to hear a story about a guy who kind of lucked out as opposed to a guy that like had to struggle and work his way up all the time. No, I'm not saying he didn't work, and I'm not saying he didn't go through struggles. There's the whole story behind him and the cat, Stacey Carter, is actually quite heartbreaking for me to read. But he's had a very different path than a lot of other guys. And I think his stories are fascinating. Plus, he's hilarious. Jerry Lawler's a very funny guy, whether that's through audio or through the written word. He's a very funny dude. So I really enjoyed reading Jerry Lawler's book. I'm also going to shout out The Death of WCW by R.D. Reynolds. You want to talk about a fascinating look, sometimes hilarious, sometimes sad, look at the business aspect of pro wrestling. This is a good read. R.D. Reynolds, for those who are not familiar, is the brain behind WrestleCrap, the very worst in professional wrestling, which is another pretty fun book if you want to just kind of look back at the weirder side. Death of WCW definitely takes more of a look at what the heck happened. And of course, they have fun poking at some of the more ridiculous stuff that led to it. But it's those last few chapters when we're really getting down to the final days of WCW and the stuff behind the scenes going on. What happened? How did this happen? Like, how did this huge company fail? How did it get sold for so little? It's a real fascinating look, and I appreciate that one. The last book I'm going to mention, my favorite wrestling book of all time, is one that most people I know haven't heard about. I'm going to highly recommend that you specifically read this one because I think you're going to flip when you read it. It's called Pain and Passion, The History of Stampede Wrestling by Heath McCoy. This is the best wrestling book I've ever read. It is an incredible account of one of the wildest wrestling promotions ever. The fact that I'm Canadian obviously plays a part into it. But even then, you know, the fact that Heath went out and he got interviews with, you know, Bad News Allen, he went out and he talked to the Hearts. He talked to a lot of people as much as he could. So it's a third party perspective trying to kind of piece together this story that's, you know, radically different depending upon which perspective you're looking at it from. And he tries to present all perspectives. I have always said that in a fantasy world where I'm given millions of dollars to adapt any story into a movie, this is the book I adapt. Either a movie or I would love to see this as an HBO series. Like an HBO series about Stampede Wrestling, that would be amazing. And it's all because of that book. So I highly recommend Heath McCoy's Pain and Passion.
I've almost picked that book up like 10 times. It just hasn't for some reason. It's
Trust me, you will not regret it. Do it. You will love it. So let's get to number one. I think I have an idea of what it's got to be.
It's pretty objective, I think. And you know what? I did struggle back and forth because I probably, part of me enjoys Hitman better. I think it's a more comprehensive, more immersive, more ridiculously just like tasty story behind some of the greatest stories in professional wrestling. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, I think there's just something so likable about Mick Foley.
Sure.
I think there's just something so relatable and he wrote. This was pretty much the first one that really got huge, right?
Yes, absolutely. This is the one that kicked off this idea that wrestling biographies sell, especially if they're coming from the wrestlers themselves, which this one absolutely was, as he details in Foley is Good. But yeah, man, and to boot, as I've been waiting to say all episode, this was my first wrestling book.
Yeah.
Because there weren't wrestling books before this. Again, you couldn't go into a Kohl's or an Indigo. I don't know what the equivalent is down south if there is one. Chapters here. You couldn't go.
Barnes and Noble?
Barnes and Noble would probably be a good equivalent. You couldn't go into one of those shops and go through the biography section and see a lot of wrestling books there. There weren't any, unless it was like a coloring book or like a comic book kind of thing.
Yeah.
Mick Foley was the guy that broke the mold and say, hey, listen, people will read our stories if we put them out there. And read them we did. New York Times bestseller, as he always said, likes to quote and whatnot. Yeah, have a nice day. It's an incredible book.
It's unbelievable. It's easily the best of his. Right back to my origin story stuff,
sure.
Right? Like it was always probably going to be my favorite. But he's funny, he's likable, he's dorky, he's a goof. But like Mick,
and he's passionate.
He's passionate, especially in '99 when he wrote the book.
Yeah,
right. Like he just loves what he does. He's still currently doing it at the time, right?
Yeah.
This isn't written like Bret Hart. It'd be interesting to see what Bret Hart would have written if he had written the book in 2000. Oh
yeah,
better because it would have had a completely different tone. It would have had a completely different outlook. Mick Foley's still in the business. One of the big. He had just won the WWF title when this book was released. It was written before he was champion, wasn't it?
The book was released. No, it wasn't, because it ends with him winning the championship.
Oh, yeah.
It was released in the summer or fall of '99, because in the second book, Foley is Good, which I think I may have read just as many times as the first one, he chronicles about how he felt like the book was a good capper because he was going in because he was hurting so bad that he went to Vince McMahon and said, I think I'm done. Like, I don't think I can do this anymore. And he said that the book is kind of the perfect way to end my career because I've told my story now. And then Vince convinced him, we're going to send you, if you feel like you're done, you've had your last match. And Mick was like, I got one match left in me.
Yeah.
Give me Triple H in a street fight at the Royal Rumble. I'll get in shape and I can do that one last match. And then
LOL. Classic wrestler. No, everything about this book is perfect. Honestly, it's such a goofy beginning, even like the foreword, he basically laid the book out geniusly, I think, because if he would have just gone into like, I was born to Jack Foley and yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. It wouldn't not that it wouldn't have been interesting, but he starts off the book with Germany and losing his ear.
I can't believe I lost my effing ear.
Yeah.
That's the first lines in the book.
First one, and one of very few curse words in the book.
That's right. But as he says in the book, there's only very few places you can use it sparingly. And here, and you know, this is proof. Here you and I are distinctly remembering passages and lines and stuff from the book because we've read it so many times and because it's stuck with us. And a really good book will do that.
Him, you know, his time in WCW was like such an interesting story. Obviously, it was great to hear about Japan and like some of the crazy stuff that he did over there. Mick Foley is one of the most interesting professional wrestling careers ever.
There's no question about it. And there is something to be said about being the guy that proved wrestling fans can read, and they want to read if you give them a good story. And boy, did we ever eat it up.
Oh, man.
And we'll continue to do so as long as good books keep coming out, you know?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, go and check it out. All those books that we mentioned, to avoid the ones that we told you not to. Anything else you want to say about the list before we wrap it up?
No, I just go read more, guys. Invest in yourselves and read a little bit more.
I like that. That's a good way to look at it.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea what you want to talk about, like what you and Cole are doing next week? Is he picking?
I don't know. It is Cole's week next week. I can tell you that I've already begun research on my episode to follow, though. I'm doing NXT main events, best NXT main events. I'm looking forward to it. But I'm trying not to burn myself out like I've done in the past with like, I'm going to watch 15 War Games matches. And then by the end, they all just like...
Is the NXT, are two of the NXT War Games matches on the list so far?
I believe one of them is up for consideration.
Okay.
I think the second one is one that I think I'm going to watch both of them. But
I wonder what I would put as my favorite NXT main event.
Main event, not match. Main event.
See, that would be a little difficult because immediately I would go Sasha Banks and Bayley from Brooklyn.
And I think something like Sami Zayn, Shinsuke Nakamura.
Absolutely agree. But those weren't the main events, though.
Not on the list.
That being said, Sasha Banks and Bayley did main event the pay-per-view afterwards.
They sure did.
Pretty damn good.
I've actually never seen that match.
You should go back and watch it.
So it's on my list. It's on my list to watch. I went back and I there's 26 takeovers. I'm not going to watch every single one of them because some of them just are like
one of the Balor Joe matches has got to be on there.
It's definitely.
I've loved every one of their matches.
I've only watched a few so far, so I haven't even like built the list yet. But it's coming. I'm looking forward to it.
Now I am too because we've been talking about it.
And I started to do this thing because I usually take notes on matches. I've started to just voice record while I'm doing it.
Oh, cool!
Just like
that's smart.
Talk about the crowd. That way, I'm talking about it more in real time in my head, and and I can expand on those things once it comes down to.
I love watching visual media. It's fantastic. Yeah. It's why we have our own YouTube channel, which all of our listeners can go to right now and subscribe, and we'd appreciate that. We're building our way to 100. We would love to get 100 subscribers. So if you haven't yet, go and subscribe. We've got some great videos coming up from our weekends in the SummerSlam Toronto area, and also from Ottawa, Fighting Back, Chinlock Wrestling. I've got a bunch of package piledriver stuff and some other things I'm working on, which I'm keeping quiet and keeping kayfabe for right now coming up, but those will be revealed all in time. So make sure you hit that notification button so that you can know when it's coming up. Okay? I think that's everything. I think that's the only thing left that I didn't shill in the first opening. So
I think you're right, yeah.
So we'll leave it at that and say, hey, thanks so much. Of course, if you want to support us financially, do so over at patreon.com/WrestleMedia.ca. But if you can't, you can be our own personal Dave Meltzer and give us 5 stars on iTunes. You like that?
That was good.
Yeah, it's great. Give us 6 if we're in the Tokyo Dome, which we are not today.
7. He got up to 7 this past year, man.
Oh, yeah, he did. I forgot about that.
Different talk for a different show. Go ahead.
5 stars. Be our personal Dave Meltzer. Give us 5 stars and a great review over on iTunes. But if you can't even bother to do that, if you're like Andrew and you just hate Dave Meltzer's guts, I don't know if you hate his guts.
I don't.
There you go. Just share the podcast, man. Tell somebody about it. Tell somebody, hey, did you hear these guys talking about wrestling? Tell a book lover about this podcast. They may be a closet wrestling fan. You don't want to say, hey, you know what? I was just listening to a podcast about books. And they'll go, what? I like books. Maybe I should listen to this. And most of them will probably turn the podcast off a few minutes in, but some of them will go, you know what? I also like wrestling, but I don't tell a lot of people about this. Maybe I'll read some of these books. And then I'll become a fan.
This is reminding me Oh gosh, one last little thing. Just when you said that way you said about books in the Rush documentary, Sebastian Bach from
Skid Row.
He's one of the featured like interviews in the movie, and he goes, at one point he's like, man, it was the craziest band in the whole world because they were like talking about trees talking and like Rivendell, Lord of the Rings, and I'm like, damn. This band is getting me friggin' fired up about books.
If you're listening and you know Sebastian Bach, please pass this podcast along to him.
Because I'd love to get Sebastian Bach fired up about books.
Boy, would we ever. We hope you got.
I'm gonna send this to him on Twitter and say, hey, if you want a podcast to get you fired up about books, check it out.
This is the one right here. Thank you so much for listening. Andrew, anything else before we wrap it up?
No, sir. We're all good.
Take us home then.
No. Can you take us home for old time's sake, please?
This
time I'm really going to let you do it.
Oh, all right. Then I appreciate that. Thank you. And as a matter of fact, I'm at Adam Conta. That is the appreciative Andrew Kent. There you go. I kind of worked it in there. And on behalf of WrestleMedia, when it comes to the 5 best wrestling books, we're breaking the hold.
This has been a presentation of WrestleMedia, where everything is wrestling and wrestling is everything. Here's what you're missing out on right now over at patreon.com/WrestleMedia.ca.
Anna Kendrick shoots the husband because Blake Lively reveals a conversation that she had with the husband where the husband says, she means nothing to me. I've loved you. I've always loved you. Let's get back together. Blake Lively figures out that it's a setup. The husband and Anna Kendrick were setting her up to confess the truth so that she would go to prison and they could get the money. But Blake Lively figures it out. She calls their bluff, and essentially they're like, damn it, you figured it out kind of thing. At this point, Blake Lively...
Sounds like an episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, the Halloween episodes, how convoluted they're getting. Anyways, go ahead.
Yes, you are 100% correct. And if this was a comedy TV series, this would make sense. And again, if this was a regular Paul Feig movie, this would make sense. But you have to understand, for the first 80 minutes of this movie...
Just a drama.
It has been a straight drama.
Want more? Sign up now at patreon.com/WrestleMedia.ca.